Hello ladies and gents, Jarek Defiler the Patient Gamer here to gush about a little indie RPG called Wildermyth. I was browsing games in Steam and discovered Wildermyth in my recommendations feed, and it goes to show the competence of Steam algorithms because this is a winner, and I'm so glad I was recommended it. At this point, I can't stop playing. Developed by small Austin-based indie studio World Walker Games, Wildermyth is a story-driven turn-based RPG where you go through different chaptered campaigns, managing and building your party as you progress through the story and side stories on your way to a main objective. So many good studios coming out of Austin in the last couple of years. They're doing something right. Probably all that Texas freedom. Anyways, as of writing this, there are 9 single-player campaigns and 2 multiplayer. I've only beaten the first campaign, Age of Ulsrix, and it took approximately 15 hours. This is the shortest campaign at only 3 chapters to all the others 5. So as you can see, there is a lot of bang for your buck here. And that's before we've even discussed the nitty-gritty of the procedural generation. From what I've experienced, there is an immense amount of replay value here. When getting started, you have the option to customize your campaign and characters fairly intricately. There is a decent amount of difficulty options for your playthrough, from storyteller to the apt walking lunch, as well as custom approach. You even have a carved in stone option, which is basically your hardcore or Iron Man mode. Then you have the ability to customize your starting party members. This is pretty great as you can virtually adjust every aspect of them, even that of their sexuality and ability to have romances or rivalries in the playthrough, because that does have an effect on things. And yes, you can make their skin green, because why not? Pretty awesome features if you ask me. Giving the player freedom to choose and make funky characters is always a plus in my book, so give a like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you're interested in more videos on games that allow these features. So on to the campaigns and how they work. You find yourself on the Overland Map, where you will guide your characters across different territories, defending against the various enemy types as well as building up defenses, bridges, or clearing out infestation that will grant the enemy extra strength. You travel from territory to territory, scouting out and fighting back enemies and assaulting their forces in order to free that territory and usher it back into the hands of its people. Different territories will hold different events, towns, and resources, all of which are procedurally generated with map seeds. Some might grant you a crafting shop where you can build new weapons, some might give you iron or fabric, and others may allow you to recruit new members to your party. There's never any downtime in the Overland Map because you're constantly managing these various systems, sometimes even splitting up your party to take on different tasks at once. It's very intuitive and strikes a perfect balance of keeping the player busy without frustrating them with too much to do at once. They really did a great job in the overall campaign gameplay. I don't really have any criticisms in that regard, to be honest. Outside of progressing on the Overland Map, you have the combat scenarios where you will take on your enemies on a tile grid battlefield in turn-based fashion. There's also a cover system where you can use various objects on the field of play to your advantage. There's a great variety of combat mechanics here, which left me quite impressed coming from such a small indie studio that only had 6 employees. The enemy variety is very good, and I was still discovering new enemy types in the last 2 to 3 hours of my campaign run. And those were just a fraction of the overall enemy types in the game, because one campaign generally has a main enemy race, you can say. For instance, I was playing against the Gorgons, but there are several others, each with their own unique enemy types within their race. They did a great job with variety here, and I applaud them for it. I was never bored in combat. Speaking of enemy variety, as you progress in the campaign, which can last for several in-game decades, you are basically building what I call an Antideck. This is a passive deck that holds cards that benefit your enemies, so you might get a card that adds some enemy types or those that will strengthen enemy types. As you progress, this anti-deck will become very large, leading to your enemies becoming much stronger and more advanced. However, you have options to use Legacy points, which is kind of the game's main currency for your overland actions, to block some cards from being added to the anti-deck. This is fairly strategic because you won't have enough Legacy points to block most of the cards. You have to pick and choose what you want to block, thus crafting your anti-deck in the best way you can. So say your party is somewhat glass cannon and they struggle with strong, fast melee enemies. You can attempt to block any cards that benefits those enemy types, while leaving the others be. It's really interesting and engaging and makes you use that thinker nut. It took me a little bit to understand what was going on, and by the time I did, my Gorgon deck was so big that by the end of my campaign it was a struggle because my deck had a massive amount of low-level minion cards that would just rush me. But I learned my lesson and started building my party to handle it. More frontline defense characters, stronger archers, etc. In the end, I prevailed and lessons were learned. Overall, I really love this anti-deck system, and it brings a whole new aspect of progressing combat difficulty in gaming. I hope other developers take on similar systems that implement creativity and innovation rather than just a stats increase type deal. Now that's how the enemies work, but what about your party members? Well, there is a good variety of options there as well. You can build some powerful, heavy-hitting frontline warriors with big defenses and armor, or you can have some nasty backline hunters that pick off enemies from afar. Warriors have a good variety of builds, allowing them to grant buffs to their allies upon kills, being extra tanky, or allowing them some cool counterattack abilities, among other things. Plenty of options here depending on your playstyle. Hunters can be stealthy, become hidden, and infiltrate the enemy's backline before exposing themselves, or hang back and just build to be extra archery with huge hits. Another fun build is you can make them to be these high mobility hit and run assassins. The sky's the limit, tons of options here. But perhaps the most interesting class is that of the Mystic, which aren't your standard mage type. The Mystic in Wildermyth mainly uses an ability called Infuse. What this does is allow them to infuse any objects on the field of play with their magical manipulations. Depending on their build and what objects they infuse, there will be different abilities they can do. For instance, if a Mystic infuses a tile that has fire on it, they can then move that fire around to burn their enemies and even set up a defensive line with flames that forces their enemies to either cross them and get burned, or go around them. If you infuse a bush or plant, you can use vines to pull enemies in and pin them. Infuse a pile of wood and you can explode it, sending shrapnel all over the place. Infuse a rock and you can launch chunks of it that bounce around between your enemies. And that's just for starters. As you level your Mystic, you can build them into having even more powerful infuses that do a variety of different things. Where warriors and hunters excel in high damage to a single target, Mystics are more capable of AoE attacks, but can still dish out some hefty single target damage as well. It's always beneficial to keep one in each combat scenario, although you don't have to. You can build nothing but warriors if you want, it just might not be that efficient or easy. Up to you. There is permadeath in combat, however your characters each get a second chance per campaign. So whenever a character first gets defeated in combat, you will generally be given 3 procedurally generated choices. These vary from character to character, but it will be something like let them escape and they'll take either a temporary or permanent debuff, such as 2 less HP or speed or something, or you'll be given 2 options to allow them to die, but your party will get a benefit for the remainder of that combat. The benefit can be something like before your character dies, they give out a war cry that gives everyone +2 to speed. Or your character does one last triumphant attack before falling, dealing 16 damage to a random enemy. It's a really cool system and allows you a second chance with the character you've grown attached to, or you can just choose to get rid of them and thus buff your group. Now, with all that said, the real meat and potatoes of Wildermyth is in its storytelling, characters, and the procedural generation that all that entails. This is where the game shines. Wildermyth has perhaps one of the most unique methods of storytelling I've ever personally experienced in a video game. It's not linear at all. Everything is procedurally generated. The characters you find, the events you stumble upon, and the relationship your characters forge with each other. All are randomized and yet it fits. I don't know how. Worldwalker Games crafted the narrative building aspect of Wildermyth masterfully. Way smarter than me. You will become super attached to your characters as you watch them grow old, forge alliances and rivalries, create romances, and even have children that you can then recruit into your party later on down the campaign's timeline. It's brilliant. And a lot of this you are directly involved in, because despite it all being procedurally generated, you are still given a great deal of choices when it comes to making decisions in the narrative of your characters. For instance, I had a mystic named Gurantha. She was an older lady that I had been using for many in-game years. We stumbled upon an event called the Wolf Price. Going through the plotline, you're eventually granted the option to take an oath from the wolf god, or you can insult it or just refuse it. Naturally, I chose to take the oath, which then turned Gurantha into a werewolf that granted me 6 years off her retirement age, as well as new melee abilities in combat. So a low HP glass cannon mystic suddenly got the option to actually hold her own a bit in melee combat, without sacrificing her mystic abilities, mind you, because she still gets to keep those. Friggin' awesome! It was a cool little event that completely added to the character, not only narrative, but combat as well. This is very common in Wildermyth. The choices actually matter. I had a dude that was granted a fire blessing that left his arm aflame, allowing him to lay down a cone of fire in combat. I had another dude that got his leg turned to this magical stone that he could then stomp on the ground in combat and stun enemies around him. Other transformations lead to characters being able to speak with other creatures in future events because they hold the same magical presence. Some events will grant buffs, some will open up new plotline pathways, and others might hinder you. It all depends on the random events and the choices you make during said events. Really good stuff here. This is where the game really hooked me. The writing was a bit confusing at first, even off-putting if I'm going to be honest, but as I continued on and got familiar with the style, I grew to adore it. The writer or writers grant a very unique voice to the characters that give them a great deal of personality and nuance. The side stories and events are extremely interesting. Special shout out to one of my favorites called Stories of Fire, which entails one of my mystics approaching a pillar of finds him of an ancient story of a squirrel that conversed and complimented the sky, which then grew the young sky's ego and made her plant a tree of fire to impress the squirrel, but ended up consuming all of the forest, including said squirrel. The sky then became depressed due to her hubris and spilled her bowl of star wine, which doused the flames of the fire. So whenever there is a wildfire, there is always a rain to douse it. This then grants you the choice to have your character dip his hand in the pillar of fire, which grants him the permanent buff of the flaming arm I mentioned earlier. The most interesting part about this is that when I recruited that particular character much earlier in the playthrough, I chose him to be an aloof poet. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think I wouldn't have stumbled across that specific event if I didn't choose to make him a poet early on, as that event ties into him being familiar with stories and poems and things like that. That is the art of the writing and procedurally generated event system based on player choice in Wildermyth, and it's fantastic and worth every RPG player's time to experience in my sensual opinion. Now let me finish the praise with the legacy function of Wildermyth. As said before, there is permadeath. However, as the campaign progresses through the decades in-game, your characters will grow older and retire. But when the campaign is finished, all the characters that you use will be ushered into your legacy heroes' pool. The ones that lived will be playable as recruits in other playthroughs. Now you don't get all their abilities, and their gear is scaled down to tier 1, but you do get to keep any special attributes that they gained in prior playthroughs, such as the flaming arm or werewolf form, etc., which is great. Also, at the end of the campaign, you will be granted an option to promote one of the characters that still live. This brings them from folk hero to legend, then fable adventurer, then ballad sung hero, and finally mythwalker. All of these characters may be brought up as background characters in events, or playable characters on your next playthrough as well. Really awesome stuff. Now, I don't have too many criticisms of Wildermyth when it comes to gameplay. I think it has really solid mechanics and gameplay loop, but some of the RNG is a bit rough, even when it comes to making choices on certain events. For instance, before battles you have options to prepare, such as charge in, stealth your way in, or hold back for nightfall, that sort of thing. These all have a percentage chance of success that is shown when you're making the choice, allowing for a beneficial preparation. With each success comes buffs for that combat round, like charging in will give you extra damage and speed I think, while stealthing in will grant your party Grey Plane status at the start of the round, which is a hidden mechanic that stealths you from enemies. However, there is one option where you can attempt to start a fire in order to confuse and distract the enemy. I have tried this several times on different combat rounds and have never succeeded. I'm assuming it's not meant to be a success no matter what, as sometimes I had almost 80% success chance and still wouldn't get it despite trying multiple times. So it's hard to be confident in some of the RNG aspects when it comes to making choices. That said, it's not that big of a deal. Mostly your choices feel legit and the results are fine. RNG in combat is perfectly fine. Sure, sometimes you'll get those enemies that will dodge you 5 times in a row. Nothing like Battle Brothers or Darkest Dungeon RNG, God forbid. I did have some graphical issues in regard to bloom and lighting from fires during combat. I was doing a gigantic AoE fire pit and all these guys, and it just turned the screen to this violent bright mush. Removing bloom helped, but it was still a problem to the point where I could barely even see what was going on. But even that was a one-time thing, so hard to criticize the game for it. Wildermyth is just a great game with very little downsides. Of course, if you're not a fan of reading or storytelling, then it may not be for you, but that's its strong point. Your characters will forge meaningful relationships, you'll grow attached, and may even shed a tear when one passes. Unless you save scum like me, but I still lost 3 in the end. Some might not like the game's graphics, as it is a hand-drawn style where in combat everything looks like it's made of paper. This is a specific design choice that I found to be very appropriate and functional, as well as allow the developers to cut corners in the graphical phase of development. It doesn't take away from the game at all in my opinion, and the comic strip style of storytelling is very competent and even beneficial I think. It allows for short spurts of visual information with great writing and no text dumps. I dig it personally. So overall, Wildermyth's combat is engaging and much more complex than seen on the surface. The Overland map is probably the game's weakest point, but it still keeps you engaged and is a nice break from combat, allowing you to get a feeling of progression with occasionally crafting weapons or building defenses. The procedurally generated stories and characters are the game's best points, allowing for some truly immersive playthroughs that will find you growing attached to your band of miscreants and rabble. And this wouldn't be a Jarek Defiler review if I didn't leave a snippet from the game's soundtrack. Composed by Candy Emberly, Wildermyth's OST is a delightful treat of violins, dulcimers, and cellos that has an almost old western feel to it that I found to be very relaxing and complementary to the game's graphical style and themes. So thanks for watching, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you'd be so kind, and let me know what you think about Wildermyth in the comments below. I, for one, can't stop playing it, so I hope you'll be willing to give it a chance too. You all have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are. This has been Jarek Defiler, basking in the revelry of Wildermyth. Have a good one.